Felix Blackwood sat in the dim glow of his study, the flickering light casting long, shifting shadows across the room. Outside, the night was a blanket of darkness, the kind that pressed against the windows and seemed to reach into the corners of his mind. He had handled hundreds of paranormal cases over the years, each one chilling in its own way, but nothing had prepared him for what lay ahead. The phone buzzed on the desk, startling him. He picked it up without thinking, already knowing the caller. "Felix Blackwood," he answered, his voice steady despite the creeping unease that had settled in his gut. There was a pause on the other end, a breath drawn so raggedly, so filled with terror, it felt as though something had clawed its way into the woman's very soul. Then a voice broke through the silence. "Please, help me," Isla Thornfield whispered, her voice trembling so violently it shook the very words. It's still here, watching me. It moves when I sleep. It's touched me. Something isn't human." Felix's heart seized. His hand clenched the edge of the desk as his mind raced through countless cases. Objects moving on their own, whispers in the dark, footsteps in empty hallways. He'd seen it all before. But Ila's voice was different. Frantic, desperate, and filled with raw fear. This wasn't just another haunted house. This was something far worse. "Isla," Felix said softly, "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning." "It started a month ago," she began, her voice hoarse. Small things at first, doors creaking open when they should have been locked, lights flickering, shadows moving across the walls. But then it got worse, so much worse. Felix leaned forward, his breath shallow, as the words sent a chill racing down his spine. "I woke up 2 nights ago," Isla continued, "and everything was different. My bedroom was a nightmare. Furniture was overturned, my clothes were in the middle of the floor. But the worst part, I saw something. Not something I could mistake for my own mind playing tricks on me. It was watching me." Felix's pulse thudded in his ears. He knew what was coming next. What did it look like? He asked carefully. "I couldn't describe it," Ela whispered. "It was wrong. A shape too dark, too formless, like it didn't belong in this world. It didn't have eyes, but I felt it staring, right into my soul. And then it touched me." Felix's breath caught. He had dealt with spirits, demons, entities that couldn't be explained, but something about her words twisted his gut. This wasn't just fear, it was terror, the kind that clawed at your mind, leaving you helpless. "Touched you?" Felix repeated, his voice strained. "What do you mean?" "I woke up to find my skin scratched, like it was trying to leave something behind. Words, signs, and they weren't normal. They were dark, ancient, twisted symbols I've never seen before. It carved them into me." Felix's chair creaked as he leaned back, his fingers tightening around the armrests. He had dealt with malevolent forces before, but Ela's account was something else entirely. There were no words to prepare him for what this could be. "I'll come to you," he said at last, his voice firm. "Give me your address." Isla provided the location, her voice a trembling whisper. Felix hung up and sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking into his very bones. His heart pounded harder, each beat a reminder that he was heading into something far beyond any investigation he'd ever undertaken. As he gathered his equipment, cameras, detectors, and protective charms, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. This wasn't just a haunted house. This was something ancient, something malicious, something that had seeped into Isla's home like a poison, twisting reality itself. The journey to Ila's house was quiet, the road illuminated only by the flickering headlights of his car. The street was eerily still, the darkness pressing down on him with an oppressive weight. When he arrived, the house stood there, an ominous silhouette against the night sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at him. Isla met him at the door, her face pale and drawn, her clothes rumpled and disheveled. She ushered him inside, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind them. "It's worse than I can describe," she said, her voice cracking. "It's inside my head. I can feel it, always watching." Felix activated his camera, its red light flickering softly in the dim room. He set up his equipment, scanning the space with EMF detectors and motion sensors, while Ela stood nearby, clinging to her own trembling hands. "We'll get through this," Felix said softly, though the confidence didn't reach his voice. "We'll find out what's causing this." Ela nodded weakly, but her eyes betrayed her doubt. She kept glancing over her shoulder, watching the corners of the room as though expecting something to step out of the shadows. Suddenly, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Felix's breath fogged in front of him, and the quiet hum of the devices went dead. The room fell into absolute silence. Then a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably there, slithered through the darkness. It was a voice unlike any Felix had heard before, deep, guttural, and inhuman. It spoke no words, just the sound of something ancient and malevolent breathing directly into his mind. Felix's heart thundered, his vision blurring. He felt it, something brushing against his arm, icy fingers digging into his flesh. His breath quickened as his mind screamed to move, but his body refused to obey. Isla shrieked beside him, falling to her knees as the whisper grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of torment. The entity was here, closer than ever, and it wasn't leaving. "Run," Felix said, his voice harsh, frantic. "You have to." But there was no escape. Felix arrived at the edge of town, the car's headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the empty road. The wind whispered through the trees, swaying their bare branches like twisted fingers reaching out from the darkness. The house loomed ahead. A massive, crumbling Victorian structure looked as though it had been forgotten by time. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes staring out into the night, and the air around it felt thick, suffocating. It was as though the house was alive, breathing in the cold night air, its very foundation pulsing with something unnatural. He parked the car, his heart pounding as he stepped out into the chilling night. The smell of damp wood and mildew hit him immediately, a staleness that settled in his chest. The front door creaked open, and Isla appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot and sunken. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair tangled, as though she hadn't slept in days. The moment she saw him, her shoulders sagged with a faint sigh of relief. But it was clear, she was terrified. "Thank you for coming," Isla whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "I don't know how much longer I can take this." Felix nodded but didn't speak, sensing that words were unnecessary. He followed her inside, his boots echoing in the silence of the house. The moment he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down his spine. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The walls were cracked, peeling, and there was an odd dampness to the air that seemed to come from every direction. As Isla led him through the darkened halls, she pointed to various rooms, her voice trembling. "Things move when I'm not looking. Furniture, books. It's like the house is alive. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like something is watching me, always." Felix took a deep breath, nodding as he followed her into the first room. It was a parlor, old and worn, with an old chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out any light, leaving the room bathed in an oppressive gloom. Felix's eyes scanned the area, noting the overturned chairs, the dust-coated furniture that had clearly not been moved in ages. He set down his bag of equipment, pulling out the essentials: cameras, motion detectors, and the EMF reader. "I'm going to set up here," he said, his voice calm but with an underlying tension. "If something's moving things around, I'll catch it. But I need to check the energy levels in this house first." Isla nodded, but didn't seem to take any comfort in his words. Her eyes flicked around the room, her body tense, as though expecting something to jump out at any moment. Felix started setting up his devices, but immediately, something felt off. The cameras flickered to static as soon as he turned them on, and the EMF reader, which should have been giving off normal readings, instead buzzed erratically, flashing red. The air around him grew colder, his breath visible in front of him, as though the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. "What's happening?" Isla whispered, her voice rising in panic. She stepped closer, her hands wringing together in desperation. "It wasn't like this before. It's never been this bad." Felix frowned, trying to steady his equipment. But it was useless. The readings weren't just off. They were erratic, chaotic, like the house itself was rejecting the devices. He looked up, meeting Isla's wide eyes. "Something's here, and it doesn't want us investigating." He finished setting up the rest of his gear, his mind racing. He had dealt with all sorts of hauntings before, objects moving, strange noises, even violent entities, but this felt different. The house itself seemed to be alive, like it was aware of his presence. "Where did it all start?" Felix asked, trying to keep the conversation going to distract both himself and Isla from the growing tension. Isla hesitated before answering. It started when my husband, Nolan Drake, passed away. At first, it was just a few strange things here and there, but after he died, it got worse. I don't know what happened, but his death wasn't normal. Felix's interest peaked and he turned to face her. What do you mean by that? Nolan's death was ruled a suicide, she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. But I know it wasn't. He was always happy, always full of life. But after we moved in here, he changed. He became distant, cold. He started having nightmares, and then one night, he was gone, found hanging in the attic. They said he did it, but I know he didn't. I felt it. Something took him. The room seemed to close in around them as her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Felix's pulse quickened, and he glanced around the room, his eyes searching for something he couldn't see. A suicide that wasn't a suicide? A presence that twisted reality? The dots were starting to connect in his mind, but he didn't like the picture they were forming. I'm sorry for your loss, Felix said quietly, though the words felt empty in the face of what was clearly happening. But we need to understand what Nolan was involved in. Did he leave anything behind? Any clues? Isla nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she led him down a narrow hallway toward the stairs. They ascended to the second floor, where the walls grew darker, the shadows longer. At the end of the hall, she opened a door to a small, dimly lit room. The room was sparse, with a desk in the corner and a bookshelf cluttered with old, dusty books. This is where he used to work, Ela explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Before everything changed. Felix stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space. There, on the desk, lay a small leather journal, its cover worn and cracked. Ela picked it up gently, her fingers brushing over the surface before handing it to Felix. It's his journal, she said, her voice breaking. He started writing in it near the end. I don't know what it says, but I couldn't bring myself to read it. Felix opened the journal, flipping through the pages. The writing was frantic, disjointed, as though Nolan had been trying to make sense of something he couldn't. There were references to dreams, whispers in the night, and strange symbols that Felix couldn't quite understand. And then, toward the end, there was a name. The Entity. The words were scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting, followed by a sentence that sent a chill down Felix's spine. It's not a ghost. It's not human. It's coming for us, and it will not stop until it has everything. Felix slammed the journal shut, his heart pounding in his chest. The air in the room had grown heavier, and the temperature had dropped further. Isla was watching him closely, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Felix could feel it too, the malevolent force that had taken hold of the house, and now it was watching them both. Night had fallen completely, and the house had come alive with the sounds of creaking floorboards and whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, as though they were alive, moving with a will of their own. Felix could feel the weight of something watching them. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the darkness of the room, and that's when he saw it. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, a figure, no more than a shadow, stood motionless. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that pierced the darkness. Felix's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone, as though it had never been there at all. But Isla didn't seem to notice. Felix turned back to her, his mind racing. The line between reality and terror was growing thinner, and it was starting to feel as though the house itself was pulling them into its grip. Felix had been pacing around the room, his mind racing as he sifted through the fragments of Nolan's journal. The weight of the atmosphere pressed in on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness. The house was alive, it felt, like the walls were breathing with a slow, rhythmic pulse. Every creak, every whisper sent chills up his spine. He had to find something, anything that would give him a way to understand what was happening here, to make sense of the madness. Then, his eyes fell on the floor beneath him. The floorboards were old, creaky, and one of them looked slightly out of place. Without thinking, Felix knelt down and pried it loose with his fingers. A thin layer of dust and dirt clung to the edges as the board lifted, revealing a small hidden compartment beneath. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled the compartment open, revealing an old, leather-bound journal. The journal looked ancient, its edges worn and torn with time. He wiped the dust off and hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. The first few pages were filled with hurried, slanted writing. The ink was smeared in places, as though the writer had been trembling while he wrote. Felix frowned as he read the name written across the first page. Jasper Finch. It didn't ring a bell at first, but something about the name struck him as important. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the pages filled with strange symbols, random scrawls, and dark passages about the house. As he read on, the words began to become more frantic, disjointed. The journal detailed Finch's time in the house, his descent into madness as he uncovered the horrifying truth. Finch had been a previous tenant, one who had mysteriously disappeared under circumstances that were never explained. The journal told of his growing obsession with the house, his attempts to understand the entity that haunted it. His writing grew more urgent as the days went by, describing strange noises and occurrences that became increasingly violent and terrifying. "The house is alive," Felix muttered under his breath, reading one of the entries. "It feeds on fear. It wants us to suffer." Felix rubbed his temples, his own unease growing. Finch's words seemed to align perfectly with what Isla had said, but the deeper Felix read, the darker things became. Finch's obsession with the house and its power had consumed him. His writing was no longer just about the house. It was about rituals, dark, twisted rituals meant to appease the entity. Finch had tried everything, incantations, symbols, and even sacrifices, but nothing worked. The house only grew hungrier, and the entity's hold on him tightened. Felix could feel a coldness settling in the room as the temperature dropped. His breath fogged in the air, but it wasn't just the cold. There was a presence in the room with him. The whispers, faint at first, now grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, voices that weren't human and weren't alive. Felix's skin prickled with a terrible, gnawing sensation, but he pressed on, forcing himself to keep reading. Finch's writings became increasingly erratic. He started drawing symbols, strange, incomprehensible designs that Felix didn't recognize. They were scrawled violently across the pages in black ink, some of them even smeared with what appeared to be blood. The further Felix read, the more twisted Finch's thoughts became. It was clear that the entity had taken hold of him, pushing him to the brink of madness. The pages spoke of his nightmares, of dark figures that visited him in the night, of whispers that would drown out all rational thought. Then, Felix found it. The final entry. It was barely legible, written in a shaky hand with ink that looked too dark to be just ordinary ink. The words seemed to scream off the page, full of terror and warning. "I've seen it. I've seen what it truly is. It is not a ghost. It is not a spirit. It is something far worse. It cannot be banished. It thrives on the fear of those it hunts. It feeds on the suffering. And if you try to fight it, you'll only make it stronger." Felix's stomach twisted as he read those words. It was clear now. Finch hadn't just been trying to protect himself. He had been trying to survive. The entity wasn't something that could be reasoned with. It was a force of pure malevolence, feeding on terror, growing stronger with every victim it took. Felix slammed the journal shut, his hands shaking. He couldn't help but feel a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. The air in the room had become suffocating, and the whispers were no longer distant murmurs. They were right next to him, brushing against his ears. He could hear them now, distinct words in the darkness, but they were too faint to make out. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to leave, but he couldn't. Not yet. He had to find the truth. He stood up abruptly, glancing around the room as the darkness seemed to press in on him. That's when he saw it. In the far corner, the shadows shifted, something large moving in the darkness. Felix's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward it, his body frozen in place. The air was thick now, suffocating him with a terrible weight. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Felix's pulse raced and his breath hitched in his throat as the shadows began to take shape. He could see them now, figures, vague and distorted, their forms stretching unnaturally. And then, through the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. The eyes were yellow, sickly, and they glowed with an intensity that made Felix's skin crawl. For a moment, Felix couldn't move. He was paralyzed, his body screaming for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. He had seen many things in his time as a paranormal investigator, but this was something different. This was pure evil, and just as quickly as the eyes appeared, they vanished, leaving the room once again in an oppressive, suffocating silence. Felix stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The presence was gone, but the dread remained, thick and suffocating. Felix blinked rapidly, trying to clear his head. He knew now that the entity wasn't just a ghost or a poltergeist. It was something far more terrifying, something that didn't play by the rules. It fed on fear, and it didn't care who it destroyed to get what it wanted. As Felix looked back at the journal, his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold, a drawing. It was scrawled across the next page in thick, dark lines, the ink smeared in places. Felix leaned in, his fingers trembling as he traced the grotesque lines of the drawing. It was the creature, the entity. The figure was like nothing Felix had ever seen before. Its body was monstrous, twisted and contorted, with jagged limbs that seemed to stretch beyond natural proportions. Its face was a mask of pure horror, its eyes hollow, filled with an emptiness that made Felix's stomach turn. It was surrounded by a mass of dark, writhing tendrils, as though it were connected to the very walls of the house. The creature seemed to stare back at him from the page, its glowing eyes filled with hunger. Felix recoiled, dropping the journal. The room seemed to close in around him. The walls seemed to pulse, slow, rhythmic, like the house itself was breathing. The air was thick with dread, pressing against him from all sides. He had to leave, but as he turned to run, he froze. His gaze flickered to the corner of the room. The eyes were back, and they were staring right at him. The air grew colder. The whispers returned, louder this time, almost deafening. Felix's breath caught in his throat as the shadowy figure began to emerge from the corner, its glowing eyes never leaving his. The darkness twisted around it, shifting and writhing like it was alive, reaching toward him with a slow, deliberate motion. Felix's heart pounded. His legs refused to move. The whispers became a chorus, overlapping and incomprehensible, a cacophony that drowned out every rational thought. He could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, its presence suffocating, pulling him into its darkness. The room was silent, the air heavy. Felix knew in that moment there was no escape. Felix sat in the dimly lit study, the glow of the old lamp casting flickering shadows across the room. The journal lay open on the table in front of him, its pages filled with horrifying depictions of the entity. His mind was spinning, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on him like an unseen force. Every whisper, every shadow in the room seemed heavier now. He could sense the malevolence lingering in the corners of the house. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a notification. Felix reached for it, his hand trembling slightly, and read the message from Dr. Evelina Crow. Her expertise in ancient curses was well known. Her help had been invaluable in the past. Without hesitation, he dialed her number, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. "Felix," Dr. Crow's calm yet firm voice came through, steady but tinged with concern. "You found something dark. I've been researching the house's history. There are too many cases linked to this entity, and none of them end well." "What do you mean?" Felix asked, his breath catching as the silence between them stretched thin. "There are whispers of dark rituals," Dr. Crow continued, her tone grave. "The house was once used for forbidden magic. The entity isn't a mere ghost. It's something ancient, something that thrives on torment. It punishes those who cross it, feeding on their fear, their pain." Felix felt a chill crawl down his spine as her words sank in, the suffocating weight of the room seeming to grow heavier with every second. Felix's grip tightened on the phone. The idea of something that old, something tied to curses and rituals meant to invoke terror, unsettled him more than he thought possible. "The entity feeds on familial ties," Dr. Crow continued, her voice deliberate, every word carrying weight. "Isla's connection to Nolan was no coincidence. It's exploiting their bond to draw her into its grasp. The more fear and anguish it cultivates, the more powerful it becomes." Isla's face flashed in Felix's mind. Her desperate, pleading eyes haunted him. He realized just how deep the entity's grip had wrapped around her, how calculated its torment was. "What can we do?" Felix asked, his voice urgent, almost breaking under the tension that filled the room. "There is a way to weaken it," Dr. Crow said after a long pause, the hesitation in her tone speaking volumes. "An ancient incantation. But be warned, it's dangerous. Attempting to banish it could provoke the entity even further. It might drive it deeper into madness, and it could consume everything in its path. Felix's breath hitched. The thought of making things worse chilled him. But staying in the house, doing nothing, wasn't an option. The whispers around him grew louder, more insistent, as shadows flickered across the walls, shifting and writhing as if guided by some unseen force. "I'll take the risk," Felix said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his stomach, every word laced with determination. "We need to stop this before it takes another victim." Dr. Crow's voice softened, a quiet warning in her tone. "Just remember, Felix, ancient curses don't break easily. Once provoked, they don't rest." Felix disconnected the call, the silence that followed almost deafening. He glanced around the room. The air seemed thicker now, suffocating him with its heaviness. The entity's presence felt palpable, growing stronger, feeding on the fear that hung in the air like a fog. The incantation was their only hope, but it came with a risk that might cost them everything. As Felix gathered his thoughts, the room shifted again. Shadows moved erratically, coalescing into grotesque shapes that twisted and contorted in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, a haunting chorus that seemed to come from every corner. His heart pounded against his chest, but he pressed forward, determined to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The darkness felt alive, pulling him deeper into its grip. Every breath was heavier, every movement more difficult. Felix knew the entity would fight back. It wouldn't go down without a struggle. But with every passing second, the need to end its reign of terror grew stronger, no matter the cost. His voice trembled as he chanted the ancient words, the syllables foreign on his tongue. His breath came in ragged gasps as the weight of the ritual pressed down on him. The cellar, steeped in the remnants of Finch's dark rituals, pulsed with malevolent energy, the air thick with dread. Isla gripped his arm tightly, her nails digging into his skin. Her terror was evident in the way she shivered, her breath shallow and uneven. Shadows slithered across the walls, coiling like serpents, alive and writhing, as if the house itself was resisting their defiance. The air grew heavier, stifling even the faintest sound. Felix could feel it pressing against his chest, making every breath a struggle. His vision wavered, blurring as the familiar hum of his equipment flickered and died. The candles sputtered, their light dimming. The shadows they cast danced with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. With every step of the ritual, the nightmare around them deepened. They were being pulled into a world they didn't understand, a place where fear was the only currency, and escape seemed impossible. The entity responded with an overwhelming surge of power. A cold wind swept through the cellar, chilling Felix to his core, making his very bones ache. Whispers filled his ears, agonized screams, the tortured pleas of souls long lost, their cries weaving into a relentless, maddening cacophony. Twisted fragments of Nolan's final moments flashed through his mind, looping like a nightmare he couldn't escape. His screams echoed endlessly in the suffocating darkness. The shadows twisted, morphing into something far more terrifying. The air seemed to tear apart, revealing a monstrous figure, an amalgamation of darkness, dread, and decay. It wasn't human, nor could it be called a ghost. Its eyes glowed with a haunting red light, burning with malevolence. Its twisted limbs oozed a tar-like black substance, the liquid hissing and bubbling as it touched the floor. "You foolish mortal," the entity hissed, its voice a chorus of agony and hate that reverberated through Felix's very soul. "You think you can banish me with ancient words? You feed my hunger with every breath." Felix's breath caught in his throat. The creature's voice slithered through his mind, an unrelenting whisper that promised torment beyond comprehension. He stumbled back, his body frozen in place, while the shadows coiled tighter around him, like cold, unyielding hands tightening their grip on his neck. "I will take her," the entity growled, its voice rumbling through the very foundation of the house. "Your precious Ela will be mine for eternity." "No," Felix choked, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. Panic surged within him, but his legs refused to move. The suffocating presence pressed in on him, its dark power seeping into his mind, corrupting his thoughts. Nightmarish visions consumed his senses. Shapes flickered at the edges of reality, illusions designed to shatter his sanity. Suddenly, the air grew heavier. Ela's scream pierced the darkness, sharp and desperate, cutting through the oppressive void. Felix turned frantically, his eyes darting through the swirling shadows, his pulse racing. Her voice echoed, faint and distorted, calling out to him, like a whisper traveling through an endless tunnel. He strained to see her, his heart clenching as her figure flickered, consumed by the entity's dark and relentless grasp. "Isla," Felix shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. He lunged forward, fighting the suffocating force that seemed determined to pull him away. Tears blurred his vision, hot and stinging, as he struggled against the invisible hands that held him back. The shadows had her, wrapping around her like living tendrils, dragging her deeper into the abyss. Her screams, filled with raw terror, began to fade, dissolving into a hollow, sickening silence. Felix froze, his outstretched hand trembling as the silence engulfed him. He was alone now, standing in the cold, empty cellar, his ears ringing with the haunting absence of her voice. The entity's laugh echoed, low and guttural, a symphony of cruelty that reverberated through the walls. The sound coiled around Felix like a noose, tightening with every second. It was a sound that mocked his desperation, feeding on the despair radiating from him. Felix's breath came in short, ragged bursts, his chest heaving as the weight of the moment crushed him. What had once felt like a fragile glimmer of hope now felt like a distant memory, erased by the relentless darkness that surrounded him. The cellar, a place he thought might offer answers, had become his tomb, a place where even the living felt buried alive. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, trembling under the weight of exhaustion and dread. The very ground beneath him seemed unsteady, as though it wanted to pull him into its endless, churning abyss. The walls of the house pulsed with a sinister energy, alive with malevolence, bending reality into something unrecognizable. Shadows crept and slithered along the edges of his vision, twisting into grotesque, impossible shapes. Their faint, mocking laughter echoed in the unbearable silence. The air grew colder with every passing second. His breath came out in icy clouds that hung in the still air, lingering like ghostly specters. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that felt like the only sound left to anchor him, but even that was drowned out by the whispers. The whispers were everywhere now, relentless and maddening, a chorus of voices from something ancient, something that thrived on despair, refusing to let him go. He tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed his voice whole, leaving nothing but the void of haunting sounds that seemed to press in from all sides. Felix's mind blurred, slipping deeper into a nightmare where time no longer mattered. The entity's presence seeped into every fiber of his being, infecting his thoughts, turning reality into a grotesque distortion of his worst fears. Every step he took led him into another torment, visions of a decaying world, a place where the dead had risen, and creatures born of nightmares roamed freely. Faces he had once known, loved even, now stared at him from the shadows, twisted, distorted, their mouths frozen in silent, eternal screams. Nolan's hollow eyes bore into him, unblinking, his twisted expression forever etched in Felix's memory, a reminder of the pain that had consumed him. Finch's ghostly form hovered near, his bloodied journal clutched tightly in his hands, forever bound to the entity's grasp. The pain was unbearable. It gnawed at his bones, burned through his flesh. Felix could feel his body being torn apart by the darkness, his skin fading, his limbs disintegrating into shadow. Every breath became a struggle, the air thick and suffocating, as though the entity itself had wrapped around his chest, squeezing the life from him with each passing second. Then, out of the abyss, Isla appeared, her face pale, tear-streaked, her eyes wide with terror. Her screams sliced through the nightmare, but she was distant, unreachable. She seemed more like a shadow of herself, as though her soul had already been claimed, consumed by the very thing they had been fighting. Felix reached out, desperate, his hands trembling, but they passed right through her, like mist, like she wasn't real. The entity's laughter boomed, shaking the very ground beneath him, its echoes ringing in his ears, relentless, maddening. It whispered promises of eternal suffering, of a future where agony was the only reality, where nothing but darkness would ever remain. Felix tried to escape, but there was nowhere to go, only the all-encompassing terror, the endless cycle of torment that would never end. As Felix's screams dissolved into sobs, his mind unraveling, he could feel the final moments slipping away like sand through his fingers. The entity's grasp was too strong now, its relentless pull dragging him deeper into the abyss, erasing his very essence from existence. The house, once a physical place, had long since ceased to be real. It was a cursed void now, a prison for those who had been consumed by fear and despair. Hila's screams echoed faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited her, the same torment that had already taken Felix. The walls, the floor, the very air, everything was part of the same malevolent force, a grotesque monument to suffering that would never fade. The house was eternal, a nightmarish abyss that waited patiently for the next soul to fall prey to its insatiable hunger. Felix's last breath was swallowed by the darkness, his soul lost to the void forever. There was nothing left of him, no trace, no memory, only the unyielding terror that would continue to spread. The entity's hunger was endless, an infinite need that could never be satisfied. It fed on fear, on agony, and as Felix's mind shattered into fragments, the world around him broke apart too. The very fabric of reality crumbled, leaving only the consuming darkness, the endless, horrifying abyss. It would never release its grip. It would never let go.